Roger Reece Kibbe was an evil man who made a name for himself as the I-5 Strangler. From 1977 to 1987, he took the lives of at least 8 young women ranging from 17 to 29 years old. He drove up and down the I-5 highway in Northern California, picking up hitchhikers and anyone else he could get into his car. In most cases, he would strangle his victims, though in one case he slashed a woman's throat. His reign of terror finally ended in 1987 when a police officer heard screams and rushed to Kibbe's car, where he had just tried to slip handcuffs onto a prospective victim. He was known to authorities, and a search of his car turned up a treasure trove of incriminating evidence. A year later, homicide charges were brought against him, which led to a 25-to-life sentence. In 2009, the tireless efforts of investigators led to a guilty plea in 6 additional homicides. On February 28th of 2021, he was strangled by his cellmate at Mule Creek Prison in Ione, California. A fitting end for such a heinous and evil creature. Welcome back to Monster Watch. So, what made Roger Kibbe do what he did? We can't say for certain whether it was nature or nurture, though we do know that he had a rough childhood. He was born on May 21, 1939 in San Diego, California, to Jonathan and Lorraine Kibbe. Roger got beat up at home and bullied at school, which, considering what was normal in the 1940s, must have been fairly extreme to be notable. His mother is said to have been domineering, routinely beating her son. When he wasn't dealing with trouble at home and school, Roger started some trouble of his own. He was seen burying a cardboard box in a park in 1954. When it was dug up, it was found to contain 2 women's bathing suits that Roger had stolen off a clothesline. In 1957, when he was 18, he was arrested for a series of thefts of cash and coins the summer after graduating from Chula Vista High School. At the time, some might have said that the thefts were simply a youthful mistake, but he had also continued stealing women's clothing and underwear. Once he had taken them, he had a habit of cutting them with scissors as a precursor to his later acts of evil. He spent a little bit of time in jail due to the cash thefts, then seemed to straighten out. He moved north to the East Bay Area near San Francisco, and in 1975 he got married to a woman named Harriet Sullivan. All reports say that she was a hard woman, very much like his mother, and referred to as domineering in some articles. So he had spent his whole childhood getting beat up by his mother, then as an adult married a woman who picked up where his mom left off. There's no way to know what pushed Roger over the edge, or whether he was born evil, but after 2 years of marriage, Kibbe lashed out. If he was so enraged at his wife, or his home life, why didn't he simply move away? Roger Reece Kibbe's first known homicide occurred on September 11, 1977. His victim was a 21-year-old woman named Llewellyn Burley. He set a trap using a job listing to lower her defenses and lure her into his control. On September 10th, Llewellyn went for a job interview with a cosmetics company that had placed an ad at the college that she attended. Since she had heard about it through her school, she felt comfortable even when the man said that his office was under construction and to meet him in a parking lot in Pleasant Hill, California. When she got home, Llewellyn excitedly told her mother about the interview, that the man she had spoken to was in his 40s and had met her in what she referred to as a fancy van. The next day, she went to meet him for a follow-up interview and was never seen alive again. Roger Kibbe had taken her to Lake Berryessa where he attacked her, doing horrible and evil things before strangling her. Meanwhile, Roger's brother had traveled down a very different path. He became a cop, then a homicide detective. Some say that Roger would ask questions about his profession, and what seemed like innocent curiosity was in fact a monster studying how best to avoid detection and arrest. After taking his first life, there was a long pause, though who knows whether this is due to Roger actually stopping, or whether he simply had been more careful to cover his tracks. Based on the pace of his later crimes, I lean to the latter. Nearly 10 years passed before Roger Kibbe's next known victim. Laura Hedick was 21 years old when she went missing from Modesto, California. She had been in an area frequented by addicts and people willing to do anything to make a few dollars. Her boyfriend, Michael Drigger, had convinced her to walk the streets to make money for their own destructive habits. On April 20, 1986, Laura and Michael were picked up together by a man described as being in his 50s driving a white 2-door sedan. They made an agreement and dropped Michael off to get a motel room while the stranger and Laura went off to get the illegal supplies for the party they had planned. Michael would sit and wait until finally realizing that they were not going to come back. Before Laura's remains were found, 3 more women fell prey to the creature. On July 3rd, a 29-year-old woman named Barbara Scott was found on the Lone Tree Golf Course in Ione, California. There was no motive and little evidence to go on. Kibbe's murderous pace here is rapid, once again raising the question of unknown victims. Less than 2 weeks later, a 19-year-old named Stephanie Brown went missing. She had dropped her friends off in the early hours of July 15, 1986, and when she did not return home, her mother reported her missing to police. They found her car a few hours later, and as officers called around the neighboring departments, they learned that a young woman's body had been found in a drainage ditch in San Joaquin County, which matched her description. Her car was found parked on the side of the road with the headlights on, which had drained the battery, but otherwise there was nothing wrong with the vehicle. A map was found on the ground nearby, and the driver's window had been rolled down as if someone had approached her as Stephanie had been trying to figure out her route home. Her body was found partially nude with marks on her neck from where a ligature had cut off her air passage. Stephanie also had bruising on her face where she had been struck, and there was dirt and grass in her clothing from where she had been dragged through the mud post-mortem. Strangely, her hair had been cut and taken from the crime scene, and her tank top had been cut at the shoulder straps. This would become a signature of Kibbe's homicides. The scissors used were found nearby at the bottom of a puddle, but other than them and a degraded DNA sample, there was nothing for investigators to go on. None of Barbara's family or friends could think of anyone who wished her harm, and the case fizzled out. 1 month later, on August 17th, a young woman named Charmaine Sabra went missing. The 26-year-old had been driving home on I-5 with her mother Carmen Anselmi for a night out. The area was in the middle of nowhere, so even if it had not been 3:30 in the morning, it would have been difficult to find help. The pair turned on their hazard lights and waited, hoping a car would pass by. And indeed, someone did come by and stop. He offered them a ride to get a tow truck, but said he could only take one of them since his car was a 2-seater. Initially, Carmen went with him, but when they could not find anyone, the man agreed to drive them home one at a time, and that he would take Charmaine first. After all, she had a baby she needed to feed at home. But as the car disappeared into the distance, there was no way for Carmen to know that she would never see her daughter alive again. Eventually, a highway patrolman came by and picked her up and took Carmen home, but she was not able to reach her daughter. Charmaine had vanished. When she reported the disappearance, the distraught mother was not able to give a detailed description of the abductor. She had been drinking that night and could only recall that he had been a white man in his 40s with a large nose and pale skin. Even so, a composite drawing was made and distributed. As the search was underway, a horrifying discovery was made on September 6th in Sacramento, near where Stephanie Brown's remains had been found. Dental records confirmed that it was Laura Hedek. Once again, the signature cuts had been made to her clothing. This time, her attacker had used a strip of cloth from her tank top as a ligature to wrap around her throat, and her pantyhose had been used to tie her hands. But like Brown, there had also been non-functional cuts made to her clothing. There were hair samples found on her body, presumably from her attacker. With multiple victims found in a definite pattern, police began trying to find a way to catch this elusive monster. At this point, they assumed that Laura had been the first to lose her life to the unknown perpetrator. Police began going undercover as prostitutes and stranded motorists, but they were not successful. Around this time, they also dubbed the culprit as the I-5 Strangler based on his hunting grounds and the methods he used to dispatch his victims. The sheriffs told newspapers that their suspect was likely local, had access to multiple vehicles, and knew the roads and back roads of the region well. At one point, they pulled over a suspicious man for a routine traffic violation. As the police officers talked to him, they realized how closely he resembled the composite drawing of the man that Carmen Anselmi had seen take her daughter. The man's name was Reece Kibbe. He was in his late 40s and worked as a furniture salesman. He was brought in for questioning, and he told investigators that he had indeed used prostitutes and may have been in some of the areas where women had gone missing. He routinely drove the I-5 highway to visit his brother in Tahoe. As they took an inventory of the vehicles he owned, police saw that they matched those described by the witnesses. He soon became a primary suspect in the case. But investigators also learned that Kibbe's brother was a homicide detective and that Roger had discussed the case with him at length. And what must have seemed like morbid curiosity was in fact a monster learning how best to foil the investigation. But without hard evidence, they could not arrest their suspect, and more victims would be added to the list of unsolved homicides. Unfortunately, the Sabra family would get the news that they had been dreading on November 9, 1986. Her skeletal remains had been found by a hunter in the mountains of Ione County, California, about 50 miles from where she had been abducted. She was initially identified by her clothing, which was later confirmed using her dental records. Like previous victims, her shirt had been cut. A strip had been used as a ligature that was left wound around her neck, and the signature shoulder cuts had been made as well. In addition to her shirt, portions of her underwear had been cut out and hair had been pulled from her scalp and tucked into her underwear waistband. Just days before the grisly discovery of Charmaine, another woman had gone missing on November 5, 1986. Kathy Kelly Quinones was 25 when she was kidnapped from downtown Sacramento. Her life was likely taken soon after she was kidnapped, but officially she is considered deceased as of December 21, 1986, when she was found by Lake Berryessa. She had not been out in the elements long, and investigators were able to get her fingerprints. They came back to the name Tracy Lynn Goebel, which was one of many aliases she went by. Several months would pass from the discovery before Kibbe claimed another life. Karen Finch was a 25-year-old whose life was starting to come together again after a failed marriage. She had just started a new job and had recently began dating someone. On June 14, 1987, she dropped her 2-year-old daughter off with her ex-husband and drove off, never to be seen alive again. Her car was found abandoned just off the I-5. There were no mechanical issues with the vehicle, and it did not seem like she had simply walked from it, as her sandals had been left inside. A week later, a family outing turned into horror when they discovered Karen's remains dumped in a ditch in an unincorporated part of Sacramento County called Slow House. This one was different from the others, and if it had not been for the cuts in her clothing, it likely would not have been connected. The scene was drenched in blood, and it was plain that she had been through a hellish ordeal. Her bare feet were battered from walking on the rough ground, and she was covered in bruises. Unlike the others who had lost their life to ligature strangulation, her throat had been slashed twice. During her autopsy, the pathologist found something that pointed at the man suspected by police. There were small pieces of duct tape and tape residue in Finch's hair. Investigators believed that her attacker had used it to silence her, then removed it once she was deceased. The only reason to do this was to avoid leaving behind evidence, and by this time they knew that Kibbe was getting investigative information from his brother, so their suspicions of him grew. Once again, there was a pause in the crimes, whether there were other stolen lives that have not been connected, or Kibbe was just slowing his pace, knowing that each crime brought him closer to being discovered. We have no way of knowing. But if indeed he was restraining himself, he could not resist for long. Darcy Renee Frackenpole was a 17-year-old girl who had run away from Seattle, Washington. She had gone to Sacramento on what must have been a great adventure. Unfortunately, she crossed paths with Roger Kibbe and went missing. But before her body was found, the creature was caught. He had coaxed a woman named Deborah Ann Guffey into his car. He went to slap a pair of handcuffs on her, and understandably, she freaked out. The fighting and screaming drew a nearby police officer named Charles Caulfield, who quickly intervened. Once Kibbe was in custody, his car was searched. Inside, investigators found a disturbing collection of items. Notably, a pair of scissors that had been used to cut something sticky like duct tape, hair bands, an electric adult toy, and a makeshift garrote made with wooden dowels and white nylon cord, which closely resembled the weapon they would soon find wrapped around the neck of his final victim. The same nylon cord was found in another one of his vehicles and his home as well. Meanwhile, soon after his arrest, Darcy's body was found. On September 19, 1987, a jogger found her remains in South Lake Tahoe, dumped there likely as Kibbe had visited his brother for more tips. The ligature used to take her life was a length of nylon cord with wooden dowels on each end, still wrapped around her neck, and closely resembling that found in Kibbe's vehicle. Her clothing had the now familiar cuts and were scattered around the area. Astoundingly, while awaiting his trial for the assault against Miss Guffey, Kibbe was released on bail. Thankfully, police monitored him closely and learned all they could about him and his past. They learned he was a skydiver, and that the cord found in his cars and home was the same type used for this activity, though there was no reason for it to be tied onto dowels unless it was to be used as a weapon. He would eventually be sentenced to 8 months in jail for the assault against Deborah Ann Guffey, and during this time, police worked tirelessly to process the evidence against him and determine whether he was the monster that they sought. They dug through Kibbe's history and learned of his overbearing mother and wife. It seems the psychopath developed a hatred for women but was too cowardly to confront those who enraged him, and instead let his resentment grow until he lashed out. They also learned about his childhood crimes and the strange cuts that he had made in women's clothing, connecting him to the unsolved homicides that they suspected him of. A thorough examination of the cord fibers found in Kibbe's car and those found on the victims was conducted. Inside the pantyhose that had been forced into Darcy's mouth, fibers were found that were consistent with those of the upholstery in Kibbe's car. More connections began forming, as they discovered that hairs that closely resembled Kibbe's were found on victims' clothing. Paint particles were found on the cord used on Darcy that were chemically identical to particles found in Kibbe's car. This particle evidence was so damning that Kibbe's own brother called him and told him to confess. He was rearrested almost immediately upon completing his 8-month sentence. But the creature had not given up. Police let him speak with his wife, and he convinced her to get rid of a pair of shoes and a ring that belonged to one of the slain women. But it was too late. The evidence against him for the homicide of Darcy Frackenpole was overwhelming, and he was charged, and his trial began on February 14, 1991, resulting in a guilty verdict and a 25-to-life prison sentence. But police were still working to close the other cases. It seems that Kibbe realized the game was up when confronted with the evidence that investigators had compiled. In 2003, he even led investigators to Lake Berryessa in an attempt to find the remains of Llewellyn Burley, but they were not successful. 6 years later, in 2009, as Roger began going to the parole board, he was charged with 6 of the other 7 known homicides, that of Llewellyn Burley, Laura Hedick, Barbara Ann Scott, Stephanie Brown, Charmaine Sabra, and Catherine Quinones. The now 70-year-old monster was not charged with the Karen Finch homicide because the MO did not line up with the other crimes. He would plead guilty to avoid being sent to death row. Kibbe described how he would drive up and down the I-5 and pretend that his car had broken down. Those who stopped to help him would end up disappearing. When this method did not work, he would pick up prostitutes. He was successful in avoiding the gas chamber, but he did receive 6 additional life sentences, ending any chance at parole. In 2011, an absolutely heroic sheriff's deputy named Michael Bartlett brought Llewellyn Burley home. He had continued the search for her remains and succeeded where Kibbe and the other investigators had failed. Hats off to Deputy Bartlett. While some may feel that Roger Kibbe got off easy for his crimes, don't worry, there's a happy ending to this story. In 2021, he was housed at Mule Creek State Prison in Ione, California, just southeast of Sacramento. On February 27th, he got a new cellmate named Jason Boudreau, who was in prison for a 2010 homicide. Boudreau had wanted a single-man cell and had planned to do whatever it took to make this a reality. But when he learned who the elderly inmate was and what he had done, he became motivated by a sense of justice as well as a selfish desire for more privacy. Boudreau reported that he had worked for months since he first met Kibbe in November of 2020 to get close to him and gave him a false sense of friendship before they were moved into a cell together. At approximately 12:40 a.m. on the 28th, guards doing a routine check of the inmates found Kibbe unresponsive in his cell with Boudreau standing nearby. Jason, a self-avowed Satanist, readily confessed to taking Kibbe's life and claims to have carved a pentagram into his skin. With Boudreau already serving life, the state declined to push for lethal injection and instead gave him another life sentence.